We're working to connect a region of over 600 cultural bridges between our lands.
Welcome to ASEAN in Focus Weekend Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Kaloy Tabunta from the Development Academy of the Philippines. Independent policy research, training, as well as advocacy institutions are important components of the global and national arena because they tackle various issues affecting populations all over the world. With the adoption of the ASEAN community, this becomes more valuable. This is what the Institute for Strategic and Development Studies Incorporated, or ISDS, aims to contribute. It tackles international and regional peace and cooperation and human well-being. These activities are done through cooperative research and advocacy, discussion, publication, and training activities. Its approach is to identify and mobilize specialists in the fields of international relations, policy studies, and countryside development who will generate a range of options in the formulation of international, regional, national, and local policies. ISDS also conducts its own policy research studies on security and development issues at various levels of governance. And so we are very honored today to have with us the Executive Director of the ISDS, or the Institute for Strategic and Development Studies, Professor Aris Arugay. Okay. Professor Arugay is an Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City. He is also the Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic and Development Studies. He obtained his PhD in Political Science from the Department of Political Science of the Georgia State University in America. He has authored and co-authored various publications about the Philippines and the Southeast Asian region. Welcome to the program, Professor Arugay. Welcome again.
Thank you very much.
We were just together 2 weeks ago in Beijing,
yes,
where we attended the 25th anniversary of the ASEAN-China Relations Dialogue. So
yes.
How was it? How did you find the dialogue
well,
there?
It was an amazing opportunity to meet old friends and colleagues around the region, the larger East Asian region, but also to meet new friends and to somehow commemorate a very important dialogue partner of ASEAN, which is China. We know that China is the first among the dialogue partners, the major powers in the region, of which ASEAN has a strategic partnership with, and somehow other countries followed suit, and because of that, this is an indication of how important ASEAN is in securing peace and stability, as well as comprehensive development in the Asia-Pacific.
Okay, we go back to ISDS, or the Institute for Strategic and Development Studies. I understand it is a non-profit policy research and advocacy institution. So what does ISDS do?
Okay, ISDS was set up in 1991 by a group of academics who mostly come from the University of the Philippines. During that time, we know that around the world there are sea changes that are happening. The Cold War was about to end.
So this was 1991.
1991. And Southeast Asia is also changing. The Asia Pacific is changing. And what these group of academics, headed by Professor Emeritus Carolina Hernandez, thought that there was a gap in knowledge and a gap of a linkage between the academe and the policy world, not only at the domestic level, but also at the regional and international level. So ISDS was the mother of necessity is the mother of invention. There was a need to understand the complexity of all the challenges faced by the Philippines as it situates itself in the strategic map of the Asia Pacific, and somehow the private nature of ISDS lends support and credibility in its ability to independently make policy recommendations on how to improve our security, but also to how to pursue development, not only in the economic sense, but in a comprehensive manner, political, social, cultural, etc.
So you're basically a think tank.
Yes, yes.
So you do research.
We do research. We also do, that is policy-oriented.
Okay.
Okay. But we also do some form of, we use the research as tools for advocacy.
Okay.
So we don't just reach out to government. We also reach out to other non-state actors
In the Philippines.
In the Philippines, and what is important for ISDS is because it's part of a bigger group of think tanks called the ASEAN Institutes of Strategic and International Studies.
What's it again? ASEAN Institute of
Strategic and International Studies. It's unfortunate that
ISIS.
yes, it's unfortunate that ISIS now represents something else.
So you please repeat that again. This is not the other ISIS.
Right, right.
So
This is not the ISIS in the ASEAN region. So this is the ASEAN Institutes of Strategic and International Studies.
Any plan to change the name soon?
If we do that, we are giving more power to
Okay,
ISIS. So
good.
let ISIS change their names, no, not us.
Okay.
But these groups, each country in Southeast Asia has a representative think tank.
Also the 10 member
The 10
countries.
member countries,
Okay,
right?
good.
And we also pride ourselves, ASEAN ISIS, as the only think tank network that is part of the bodies associated with ASEAN as stated in the ASEAN Charter.
Okay.
So ASEAN itself recognizes not only the existence but also the role of think tanks, the role that they play in improving and strengthening the community. We hope that more think tanks will join as associated members of ASEAN. But right now it's ASEAN ISIS that somehow is at the forefront of recommending and engaging ASEAN at the track 2 level.
Okay. Where's this based? ASEAN ISIS?
Well, ASEAN ISIS is, the secretariat is in the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, in Indonesia.
Okay.
But each ASEAN ISIS member could hold activities and programs upon consultation with the rest. For example, every year we hold a strategic dialogue forum called the Asia Pacific Roundtable.
Okay.
And it's always held in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia. In fact, this year, this coming May, late May to early July, we'll be having our 30th.
30th.
Yes. So there are other strategic policy forum around the region. So what we now have the Shangri-La Dialogue. China has the Shangshan Forum. But all of these were held after the Asia Pacific Roundtable.
Okay, we will discuss more of those projects later. You also mentioned here you're engaged in training.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Training comes in the form of, ISDS is also involved in what is called trying to reform security institutions.
Okay, security sector reform.
Yes, security sector
Okay.
reform, SSR. So we want to think of ourselves as one of the first think tanks in the country to put SSR in the agenda of our national government. So we have engaged in some training of all government officials, relevant government officials, not only in the military and the police, but also in oversight institutions like congressional committees, like the National Defense Department, the National Police Commission, courts, and penal institutions. So we try to teach them about this concept called security sector reform.
Okay.
And we are also connected to a larger global network of training institutes called ASET, Association of Security Sector Education and Training.
Okay, so you have such a large network of international
Right, right.
organizations.
Sometimes ISDS is often more known outside the Philippines than inside, and that's why we
Yeah, that's
like
why-
this opportunity.
That's why I met you in Beijing.
Right, and not here in Manila.
Okay. Publications. So what do you publish?
Okay. Publications often emanate from research.
Okay.
So the research that we conduct are normally published either by ISDS itself or other publication outlets. Just an example, in 2001 or 2002, I'm not sure about the date, we published a 3-volume series called Development and Security in Southeast Asia.
Wow. Development and security. in Southeast Asia.
ISDS always believes that security cannot just be treated independently of development, and somehow this dovetails to ASEAN's thrust of comprehensive security.
Okay.
So we published that 3-volume series, one on migration, one on environment, and one book totally on environment, migration, and I think on
This is
the people, right?
Okay.
The people,
Okay.
right? So all of these are publications that are available. They're published internationally, but we also have national publications as
So
well.
how can one get hold copies of your publications?
Well, unfortunately, the 3 volumes are published by Ashgate, so it's quite expensive. I'm sure the libraries have copies of them,
Okay.
the university libraries, but some of our publications are available in our office,
Okay.
and then some of them are for free.
Okay,
We have lots of copies of that, so we're
So
more
may-
than willing to share them.
Okay, so we have a Asian Studies Center in your university. Maybe we can ask for some copies of the
Of
publications.
course, we would be very much willing to share
So,
them.
how do you get your funding? Where do you get your funding?
Okay, the think tanks normally get some form of an endowment,
Okay.
right? A big pool of resources, often given by either the government or the private sector. ISDS survives on project funding. So
Okay.
we don't have a big endowment, unlike other think tanks.
But at least you have some.
Right. So we somehow engage a lot of of international donors to commission for us to commission certain researches, certain policy analyses, and somehow that's our main source of funding.
So you also do researches outside of the Philippines?
Yes, we do. Yes, we
Okay.
do. So, for example, our current project is in fact supported by the Japan International Cooperation Agency,
Okay, JICA.
JICA, and it's about mainstreaming human security in ASEAN integration.
Wow,
So,
big words.
Yes. So, because we know that security now is not just the security of the state, but also the security of the individual human being. So we're addressing in that research project what are the threats to human security in Southeast Asia. So environmental disasters, environmental degradation, natural disasters, pandemics. We currently have research on how human security issues have affected Tacloban, Yolanda, how conflict affects the human security of people. We have commissioned researchers in Thailand and Indonesia to talk about food security and water security, for example. So that's just an example.
ISDS started mainly with the people from the Political Science Department of
Yes.
the University of the Philippines.
Right.
What about now?
Okay. The core of our researchers are part of what we call a council of fellows. So these are people that we draw from the academe, from the policy world, from the diplomatic community. So before you were right, they were all drawn from the political science department because the founders were mostly academics who are political scientists. But now we see that the issues, the research topics that we engage in require more than just the discipline of political science. So now we have geographers,
Okay.
we have sociologists, we have historians, we have lawyers that could help us augment some of the knowledge gaps that for us political scientists and international relations people might not have.
And you ask them to do research
Yes,
for you on
yes.
these different topics, and you get funding from different sources for
From
these
different
research.
sources, yes.
Okay, we will discuss more about the other activities of ISDS when we come back. Okay, welcome back to ASEAN in Focus Weekend Edition. This time we talk on the different projects of ISDS. I understand you have several programs. One of them is the Strategic and Security Studies programs. You mentioned earlier about the security sector reform. Can you please discuss briefly what security sector reform is?
Security sector reform is this new idea. It's a new idea in the sense that we cannot really have effective security if we don't include the reform of all the relevant institutions in this bigger category called the security sector. So before, what we have is defense reform, military reform, police reform, judicial reform, all these types of reforms, but there's no overarching concept.
So all of these sectors are treated separately.
Right,
so we
right.
should tackle all of this
Right,
together.
Right. This idea came from donors, particularly those that are engaged in conflict-torn countries abroad, when they saw that they keep on pouring in development aid, but because the situation is not secure, development cannot actually happen. So what is adopted is an approach called the whole of government. So it means it's quite complicated and difficult, but it requires the simultaneous, calibrated reform of all these sectors at the same time. So if you reform the military, you must also reform the courts. You must also reform the police. The military should not do the functions of the police, and vice versa.
Which is rather complicated in the Philippines.
Exactly.
Because the police and the military are, sometimes have confused roles.
Right, used to be, because prior to maybe several years ago, the main security threats in the country were internal, right? Were mainly internal. It is only now that the military is reorienting itself towards territorial defense.
Okay, so military should be on territorial defense. So this is external defense.
This is external defense.
So the internal peace and order situation should be addressed by the police.
Right.
Police.
But over time, the capability and also the resources have not been adopted in a level that conforms to their thrust and mandate. So we know that some of the internal peace and order functions of the police are still being implemented by the military.
And this is included in security sector reforms. Of course, you tackle the quote-unquote human rights abuses committed by the the players of the security sector.
Right. When you reform the security sector, you're talking also about justice and accountability.
Okay.
So this is quite sensitive in the Philippine context because there has not been a good record.
Yes, we
of
came from
accountability.
martial law. We have to understand
right.
that.
So there's not been, but part of this is also training the military and the other uniformed services on the importance of human rights protection and human rights promotion and compliance with all these international treaties that we have signed on human rights and humanitarian law.
And at the same time, we have to reform also the judicial sector.
Right. Which is also important because they exercise some form of oversight on the security sector. So cases are filed in the courts. They somehow exercise judicial review. So all of these so it requires a lot of commitment, a lot of ownership of the reform process. So if governments do not understand the intricacy of the interconnectedness of all these institutions, then security sector reform will be very difficult.
Okay, what are your particular activities related to SSR?
Right. So this has been going on for several years. We used to hold a lot of conferences and meetings just trying to inform all the stakeholders about this concept, this idea. We've invited experts from Europe, mainly from Europe, as also from Africa and Latin America. We used to be part of a global network of security sector reform institutes and research centers. Right now, what we're trying to do is to develop what we call a measurement tool that could somehow assess whether there's actual reform going on. We hope that we could be given the resources to implement some form of an assessment. In the future, we are thinking of developing maybe an annual assessment of security sector governance in the Philippines. And we have been supported several times, but this is a scientific enterprise that requires a lot of expertise, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of resources.
Okay, you also have the South China Sea Dialogue Series. What is this?
Okay, we did this way back in the 1990s during Mischief Reef. So we all know that some of the issues now on the South China Sea are not new.
This is still ongoing.
Well, now it's currently being handled, I think, by our other partners in the ASEAN ISIS network.
Okay.
So right now, ISDS is doesn't really have a South China Sea program, but we just participate in some of our partner institutes around Southeast Asia, lending expertise or telling experiences during
But shouldn't
this
you be more? Shouldn't you be holding a more, proactive stand on this now?
Right, right. You're right about that. The thing is, ISDS is also a member of a grouping of both government and non-governmental entities that are, I think, is more relevant on this. The Council for Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific, or what we call CISCAP.
Okay.
They're the ones that really look at South China Sea issues. And for example, we just held in the international conference last month, not looking at the territorial disputes themselves, but how do these tensions and territorial disputes affect, for example, the marine environment? Because at the end of the day,
Yes.
we might know, or we could have decisions on who owns what rock, what island, but the marine environment at present is being negatively affected, not only because of the reclamation and all these activities, but just the impact of climate change, the impact of the warming of the oceans, the impact of overfishing. So there should be an emphasis.
So this one being tackled by CISCAP.
By CISCAP.
What's CISCAP again?
CISCAP is a grouping.
Okay.
It's supposed to be the track 2 arm, because in diplomacy you have several tracks, right? You have the official track, which is track 1, and then you have track 2, which is more academics, scholars, and specialists. So CISCAP is track 2 mainly, composed of individuals and institutions, both inside and outside of government. But when they participate in CISCAP, they don't wear their government hat.
Yes.
They wear their individual or scholarly hat.
Okay.
So every country in the Asia Pacific has a CISCAP member committee
Okay.
that is organized every year in a big conference.
Okay. You also have the ASEAN experts on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea series. Is this still ongoing?
That is
The
also
UNCLOS?
currently on hold.
Okay.
We felt that what ISDS normally does is to provide a spark on all these issues, right? Put them in the agenda of national governments of ASEAN, and somehow we feel that if other institutes are going to pick this up,
Okay.
we've done our part. So we catalyze,
Okay.
we put on the agenda what are critical issues.
On that note, you're successful.
Now, on that note, that's how we think we are. We're a trailblazer on issues, and somehow if other actors, other think tanks, other institutions pick it up, then we think that we have done somehow our part.
Because everybody is talking about the UNCLOS right now. We're waiting for the decision of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea.
Right. We're waiting for we're holding our breath, but maybe we should not. But hopefully we can have a discussion after the decision has been made on what to do.
Yes,
what are our
yes.
next steps? What to do?
And then under your regional and international studies program, you have the ASEAN EU Think Tanks Dialogue. So what is this?
Okay. We know that ASEAN has dialogue partners, and the principle is always equidistance, meaning we don't play favorites, right? So if we have very close relations with the US, we must have equally close relations with China, with Japan, and the EU is one of our dialogue partners. So ISDS, together with ASEAN ISIS, the network, always conducts these dialogues with with major countries, middle powers, medium-sized countries on pressing strategic issues. So currently, the ASEAN EU Think Tanks Dialogue will hold a conference, in fact, in Ulaanbaatar, in Mongolia.
Oh, Mongolia. Okay.
Next month. Right?
Why Mongolia? It's not even ASEAN. It's not.
Right, but it's part of the larger East Asia region. So normally the conference is held 1 year in Asia, 1 year in Europe. So that's how it's, and this has been going on for maybe, if I'm not mistaken, more than 10 years. So somehow the venues have been exhausted. So that's why it's being held in Mongolia.
Can you comment on the EU support on ASEAN on this South China Sea issue now?
I think the EU is one of the powers in the world that has less engagement as far as the South China Sea. But of course, we know that the EU supports certain norms such as respect for international law, freedom of navigation, and peaceful settlement of disputes. So I think they are very keen on the arbitration case, and they know that for small powers like the Philippines, we normally don't have a lot of tools. And
So they support us.
support,
In
I
the
think,
form of what?
in the form of acknowledging the importance of
Okay.
settling the disputes through
Okay.
international law.
Okay. The ASEAN ISIS, this is the original ISIS.
Right.
Southeast Asia Cooperation Program. So what is this now?
Well, the ISDS being a member of ASEAN ISIS, right, somehow participates or contributes to the agenda of ASEAN ISIS. Let me, if I may, I want to focus more, for example, on the issue of human rights.
Yes.
Back in the 90s, human rights was a very sensitive issue because not a lot of governments in Southeast Asia respects human rights. You might say that maybe until now it's still the same,
That's Asian.
that's right. You have Asian values that entire debate that human rights is a Western idea.
Yes. Anyway.
You have community rights or economic rights is more important than political rights. So what ISDS did is to hold this, what we call the ASEAN ISIS Colloquium on Human Rights.
Okay.
Every year since 1995, we tried to bring together Track 1 diplomats, Track 2, and even NGOs and human rights groups to somehow talk about human rights issues in Southeast Asia, to somehow break the ice, break the discomfort. And we don't like to say that we were the reason why, for example, certain institutions were built, but it is through these colloquiums that, for example, a human rights working group was formed in Southeast Asia, and we would like to think that somehow by providing a forum for dialogue, we somehow influence, for example, ASEAN in adopting the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. So now there's no more colloquium because we felt that we have done our part.
Okay.
When we've accomplished our mission, then we move.
So what
to
do you
other
do now
issues.
related to
So,
human rights?
Right now we're trying to do more on rights that are connected to human security. So
Okay.
the freedom from fear and the freedom from want. So by focusing more on the less on the protection but on the empowerment part.
Okay. How do you determine whether it's time for you to move on?
Because we always think that the work of a think tank is to do cutting edge research.
Okay.
Cutting edge work. So we felt that if we're able to mainstream the concept, the idea, in the sense that other institutions, it might be government, it might be ASEAN itself, it might be other educational institutions, it's time for us to look for the next thing. We try to be innovative, we try to be creative, we try to trailblaze, and we know there's a lot of issues that needs attention. So while we specialize on certain things, we also want, in the end, because we're a strategic think tank, and strategic issues evolve.
Okay.
You don't have the same set of strategic issues now as you would do 10
Okay.
years later.
Okay, so all of this you moved on because some other actors have taken the cudgels.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So we'll discuss more of the activities of ISDS when we come back. Okay, we're back with Professor Arugay, the Executive Director of Institute for Strategic and Development Studies. We were talking earlier about the different engagements of ISDS on ASEAN. I have a long list actually, so maybe you could just comment on some of them. Before you had your ASEAN External Relations Study, this is a rapid appraisal of external relations, of ASEAN direct relations with the different dialogue partners.
Right.
Okay. Who are the dialogue partners you are engaged with?
Okay, we know that ASEAN has several dialogue partners, and the principle is that we need to keep equidistant relations. So we don't play favorites, right? So
Can we actually do that?
that is the challenge, right? But that is the core principle of what we call ASEAN centrality.
Okay.
Right? If ASEAN is indeed the driver in the Asia-Pacific region of security and stability, then it needs to engage. And ASEAN has always have that convening power. If ASEAN asks all these other non-ASEAN major countries to group together, they will come, like the East Asia Summit,
Yes.
right? The ASEAN +3, right? So it's because ASEAN doesn't have any ambition. It doesn't aim to dominate the region. But going back to the question on external relations, we studied to what extent ASEAN can benefit from its external partners. So after we said that these are the critical issues that we could engage our external partners, we started developing programs of annual dialogues, annual conferences. So we currently have one with China, together with the China Institute of International Studies and the
ASEAN
ASEAN
China Center.
right? We currently have one with
Korea.
With Korea, right. So for example, next month we'll have a dialogue. We have an existing one even with Taiwan, right?
Okay.
Because Taiwan also thinks that's important. It sees itself as an important player in Southeast Asia.
Does China knows that?
Yes.
Does China know that?
Yes. China knows that. In fact, China always, that's fine, but if, for example, if it's an ASEAN-China dialogue, then Taiwan cannot be invited.
Okay.
Right?
But they want to be invited in the ASEAN-Taiwan dialogue, or they're not invited?
No, they're not. I guess they're not really interested, right?
Okay.
Right? So this is a Taiwan initiative. We have one with India, and we hope to have one more with other important countries, like maybe Russia. Or even we have one with Australia and New Zealand. We have a dialogue with Australia and New Zealand. I think this is being held in Kuala Lumpur every year as well.
Okay. You also did the ASEAN Free Trade Area Study. Okay, this one is the AFTA. So
Okay.
you did the study
Right.
before.
Because we also have fellows who are economists, and sometimes they come in and say that, oh, we need to assess ASEAN's readiness. But this was prior to the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015.
Okay.
So these are all the prep work.
Okay, you also had the ASEAN Industries and Investments Study. So this is a pilot study intended to provide ASEAN member countries with comprehensive perspective of the adjustment costs and benefits of AFTA on strategic industries.
Right.
Okay. And then you have the ASEAN labor migration to Taiwan. So you had this study before.
Right.
And then one of your major activities was the ASEAN People's Assembly. I think this is the one related to human rights.
Right.
Okay, so what is this? Can you tell us about this?
There's this idea that ASEAN is not really connecting to its people, that it has remained a gathering of leaders, a gathering of it's an intergovernmental association, right? So for us in Track 2, we thought that we need to bring the people in, and truly make ASEAN a grouping not just of governments but of people. So I distinctly remember in 2000, this was not held in Manila, but this was held in a small island near Singapore called Batam in Indonesia.
Batam, Indonesia.
Batam in Indonesia, where we held the first.
It's a short boat trip away from Singapore, actually.
Yes, that's what we took, in fact. So around 500 people from government, from Track 2, from academe, and also from what we call the people sector, NGOs, social movements, people's organizations, gathered in Batam and tried to launch this ASEAN People's Assembly, where they talked about issues affecting ASEAN that range from human rights to economics to security. And that annual gathering lasted until around 2009.
Okay, 9 years.
9 years. And I think the last 4 or 5 have always been held in Manila. I even distinctly remember, I think it was in 2005, it was held here while we were even the chair of ASEAN, when the ASEAN Summit was being held in Manila. And that was historic because it was the first time that the 10 ASEAN leaders had a conversation with a representative from the ASEAN People's Assembly on what issues matter for the peoples of ASEAN. So I distinctly remember, for example, we sent a representative to go to, I think, Subic, to meet the 10 leaders of ASEAN to report what happened during the ASEAN People's Assembly. Right now, there is a separate entity called the ASEAN Civil Society Conference, which we no longer have a hand in organizing, because as I said, that's what Track 2 does, right? Once the idea flies, then we let the civil society sector in Southeast Asia handle it. So right now, they do a lot of meetings, and they hold this annual ASEAN Civil Society Conference / ASEAN People's Forum.
After 2000, that was 2005, you said when the leader of the ASEAN People's Assembly met with the ASEAN leaders. After 2005, has that been ongoing?
Right.
During the leaders' meeting, the leaders meet with the people.
Right. So now there's this practice of a parallel meeting. So every time there's an ASEAN summit, somehow in a nearby place, there would be an ASEAN Civil Society Conference.
And then the leaders actually meet together.
That's what they call it the interface.
Okay.
Though there have been some controversy with the interface, because some ASEAN governments, they feel like they need to vet, meaning they need to choose who among in their own civil society would interface with them. So this, I think,
sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar,
here
right?
In the Philippines,
right.
The
So
political leaders choosing their, civil society representatives.
Right. So this is something, I think this is part of the growing pains of ASEAN. It's still not comfortable with engaging with civil society and NGOs, but hopefully the interface will be successful.
We will be hosting ASEAN again next year. So what are the prospects of the people's leaders meeting with the ASEAN leaders?
I think it will be better than this year, because Lao PDR has banned all civil society and NGOs from entering Laos during the summit.
Wow.
Right. Though their official reason is that they cannot secure everyone, including the civil society representatives themselves. So, in fact, the civil society gathering, the conference, which is normally where the ASEAN Summit will occur, will now be in Timor-Leste.
Who is not actually a member of
ASEAN
yet.
But for the civil society of ASEAN, the grouping, they thought that this is symbolic, because there's been a push for Timor-Leste to join ASEAN.
Okay. So, and then you have the Asia Pacific Roundtable. What is this?
Right. So this is more an annual gathering, big. Might be around 500 people too. Always, it's always held in Kuala Lumpur, and this is hosted by.
Why always in Kuala Lumpur?
Because the organizer is our Malaysian equivalent.
Okay.
So the network has 10 think tanks, right? So it's the Institute for Security and International Studies in Malaysia. So they always organize this.
So what do they do here in the roundtable?
They discuss pressing security issues. So for example, there will always be, right now there's a South China Sea panel, there's a panel on the environment, there's a panel on extremism and terrorism. This is normally attended by Track 1 and Track 2. And over the years, this has been held either before or after also a big gathering called the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is in Singapore.
So the Asia Pacific Roundtable is the one in Kuala Lumpur.
Yes.
The Shangri-La Dialogue is the one in
Singapore.
What is the Shangri-La Dialogue?
The Shangri-La Dialogue is also a security dialogue forum. Right?
What's the difference between the Kuala Lumpur and the Singapore thing?
I think the difference has, in terms of the attendants who are attending, but also who is organizing. So this is organized by Southeast Asia in Southeast Asia, right? The Asia Pacific Roundtable. Shangri-La Dialogue is organized by a UK-based organization called the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So this is a European or British entity organizing a conference in Southeast Asia about Asia-Pacific issues. And in terms of attendance, normally the APR or the Asia-Pacific Roundtable are attended by people who are from Track 2, also from Track 1, but the Shangri-La Dialogue is where the actual government officials attend.
Okay.
So for example, 2 years ago, the keynote was given by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. So this is where governments try to really talk about their policies and what do they plan to do. So for example, I distinctly remember we have our defense secretary, for example, regularly attend the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Okay, we will discuss more of the other pressing issues in Southeast Asia and how ISDS react to them when we come back. Okay, we're back with Dr. Arugay. There are several pressing issues in ASEAN right now, and of course, the most controversial one right now is the much-awaited decision of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea regarding the Philippines' position against the China Sea. How do you react to this?
Well, it's a complicated issue. In a lot of the conferences that we attend, when we meet our partners, other think tanks, somehow the South China Sea issue dominates, monopolizes the discussion. However, there are so many issues and challenges faced by ASEAN and Southeast Asia, but we do expect that there would be increasing tensions. The arms buildup of a lot of ASEAN countries is seen both positive and negative. Positive in the sense that there are some countries that are now realizing that they need to put up some form of territorial defense, regardless of where the threat is coming from. But at the same time, there's this increasing tension in the sense that you all have these arms and equipment, right? And defense spending that could be devoted to other means. The decision of the arbitration is important, but I think the next step would also to explore what other tools that we have. We know that there is currently an ASEAN Code of Conduct on the South China Sea that is being drafted. I wish that the Philippine government could devote as much resources in trying to see the completion of this draft Code of Conduct as it is devoting a lot of resources in the arbitration case, because at the end of the day, we cannot avoid but see that China is a neighbor.
Yes.
That we will have to engage China
We
sooner
have
or
a long
later.
history.
We do have a long history, and in this particular issue, I still believe, even if it's heavily criticized, that the Philippines' best bet is ASEAN.
Okay. Several days from now, it will be the national elections, national and local elections. But the ASEAN is not in the, it's not in anybody's agenda among the political candidates. So what can you say about this?
Well, this is really indicative of how much less attention that Philippine governments, in the plural, have devoted to ASEAN. Like, some Filipinos are even surprised about what is ASEAN integration. What does that mean? It's only through the K-12 issue that the ASEAN integration itself has been mainstream. We know that ASEAN will be turning 50 years old next year.
Next year, 2017.
2017. And
The Philippines will be hosting ASEAN.
the Philippines will be the chair. So we're one of the founding members. And it comes full circle. Now we'll host it and we'll somehow have a say in the agenda of ASEAN's next 50 years. So I do think that the new government, regardless of who wins the elections, pays more attention to ASEAN, puts more resources in strengthening ASEAN, because it is in our national interest too that ASEAN is strong, is united, as well as capable of doing or fulfilling the vision that it is set itself. It has a current vision 2025 that we also need to look into and study.
Who should be taking the lead in creating this awareness thing?
Well, government should take a lead, but I do think government should also support non-governmental initiatives. Education is very important. Media, this entire program itself is a critical
We are the only
institution.
program exclusively devoted to ASEAN.
Exactly. So I do hope that you're trailblazing in that, right? That
Yeah.
you could somehow catalyze more
Okay.
discussions on ASEAN. But universities also play an important role.
but mainstream media is not picking up. So how can they? What will compel them to pick up this ASEAN thing?
Right. I think ASEAN itself as an organization needs to recognize the power of media. So if I'm less the Philippine government, but more so if I'm ASEAN, I'll try to have a serious engagement or dialogue with media and somehow put the seeds of ASEAN awareness in them and then let them disseminate that in their respective presses, in their respective websites. their respective
So, as
programs.
chair of ASEAN in 2017, what should be the Philippines doing now in preparation for that, and what should it be doing come 2017?
Okay, I think the critical contribution of the Philippines, being one of more or less democratic countries within ASEAN, is to promote democracy. And what is important in democracy is not just elections, it's not just, but more so that it's people-centered. Right? So I think the Philippine contribution to ASEAN is to put more flesh, to put more substance to this goal of ASEAN of making it more people-centered. So non-state actors' participation, civil society participation is very important.
The academe,
The academe is very important.
mass media.
Mass media is very important, but also issues that directly affect the lives of people, but not just people, the most vulnerable of people. So I think natural disasters
Yes.
could play a role. We could catalyze the discussions on that. Climate change is very important. Migration is very important. Illegal drugs and human trafficking.
trafficking.
So all these are issues that are not so hot because everything now is about the South China Sea. But we all know that these are the issues that affect the 600 million people in ASEAN, more than just a few rocks in the South China Sea.
So, ASEAN is 50 years in 2017. What do you want to see in the next 50 years? Should we follow the EU model, or should we chart our own destiny?
Right. We always look up to the EU, like a lot of regional organizations, as the epitome of regional integration. But we all know that the EU historical context, the context of Europe, is very much different. And we, in fact, are seeing some form of backlash or pushback from European integration. The crisis in Greece, the migration crisis with Syria, Brexit. So we see that there are flaws, even in this seemingly perfect model of European integration. So I think what ASEAN needs to do is to find its own path, to tread its own path. It's been slow. It's been it's been painfully slow.
It's the ASEAN way.
But the ASEAN way. But there are some good in the ASEAN way, but there are some flexibility that is required for ASEAN to survive in the next 50 years.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Arugay.
Thank you, Dr.
And
Kaloy.
ISDS addresses multiple issues regarding peace, security, and development in the region. It studies and disseminates information regarding policy measures on how to address unity amidst political and territorial disputes, among others. Through the years, it has engaged in many research and advocacy activities that aim to contribute to international and regional peace and cooperation, as well as human well-being. Among others, it has been one of the more active think tanks tackling ASEAN concerns. We hope to see more of these research outputs as the Philippines navigates its way in the ASEAN community. Thank you very much. I'm Kaloy Tabunda, and I'm one with 25.